Okay, let's talk about plant structure and growth, chapter 33. So, main parts of a plant are fairly obvious. The roots, the stems, the leaves. I think you probably knew that. But what are they for? Typically, roots have two roles, that of anchorage into the ground and that of absorption of water and nutrients. Stems, main job is to basically just be a supportive axis of the plant to raise the leaves and separate them so that they can intercept more sunlight, right? Make the plant taller and spread out those leaves, because the leaves have the very important job of doing photosynthesis. They're basically like a solar panel, which is why they're wide and flat, like a solar panel, because they want to intercept as much sunlight as possible. Now, as we go through this lecture, we're going to talk about modifications to stems, roots, and leaves that sometimes give them additional and sometimes surprising roles in the plant, but typically this is what they do. And the roots and the stems have kind of a give and take relationship where one relies on the other. The roots are critical in supplying water and minerals to the above ground parts of the plant, and the above ground parts, the photosynthetic parts, supply photosynthates, aka the products of photosynthesis, sugars, to the root system, so one relies on the other. Now, if we want to delve in a little bit deeper to what's going on inside a plant, and of course we do want to do that because plants are awesome, we can identify a few different tissue types in each of these major plant organs. The organs, by the way, being the roots, the stems, and the leaves. So the organs, roots, stems, leaves, are made up of different tissues. And there are three major tissue types that we're going to talk about. There is the dermal tissue system, which forms the outer covering of the plant. The ground tissue system, which is going to have a number of roles, including supporting the plant, carrying out photosynthesis, and storage, actually storing some of these photosynthetic products. So it has a storage role, a photosynthesis role, and a support role. And then we also have the vascular tissue system, which is responsible for being the tubing that will conduct water and solutes like nutrients or sugars that we made in photosynthesis around the plant. So let's look at each of these tissues in turn, starting with the outermost layer, the dermal tissue system. So much like our outer layer, our epidermis, the dermal tissue system is the first line of defense against damage or pathogens that might try to get in there. Now, if we're talking about a non-woody plant, which means that it doesn't have wood, the dermal tissue system is made of one tissue called the epidermis, which is a layer of tightly packed cells covered by a waxy layer called the cuticle. That helps keep too much water loss from happening and also is protective. Now, if we're talking about, so this would be a non-woody plant, also known as, sometimes we just call them herbaceous plants. If we're talking about a woody plant like a tree or something, then the epidermis, as the plant grows, is replaced. Oops. No, that was right. Okay. Epidermis replaced by a thicker, stronger, more complex tissue called a periderm. in the older stems and the leaves. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about secondary growth. So we also can have some cool specialization going on in dermal tissues. So we can get what are called guard cells. So here are some guard cells. Guard cells control the opening and closing of stomata. And thereby have a pivotal role in gas exchange. So this hole here, go back. This hole here is called it's called the stoma, and the whole structure is called the stomata. And these guard cells can expand or shrink to either close or open this pore, thus allowing gas in or out, or keeping gas from going in and out. Water vapor also can exit out of this pore, this stomata opening, and so this is also the ability of these guard cells to close this hole is also important in maintaining water balance in the plant. So really, really important type of cell. There are also what we call trichomes. Trichomes are typically for protection. So they're little hairs. There are these little epidermal outgrowths, so thin and fine it's like a hair. So a lot of times they get called hairs, but what they are is an extension of the epidermis. Typically for protection, they're not too nice to chew on, so it'll keep herbivores from wanting to eat them. But they also can secrete oils, which are typically also defensive to keep maybe an herbivore from chewing on them or kill a particular bacteria or something like that. And then finally, not shown in this picture, but another kind of specialized epidermis are root hairs, which are kind of similar to trichomes in that they are extension of the epidermis, but their goal, I can't write today, guys, is to increase the surface area of the root. And I will show you a picture of root hairs in a few slides, I promise, so that they can absorb more water. Okay. Next, let's talk about vascular tissue. So I know I mentioned vascular tissue just a little bit when we talked about the seedless vascular plants, because of course that was the major innovation of the seedless vascular plants, was vascular tissue. So vascular tissue are essentially the veins in the plant, right? So they'll be running the entire length of the plant from the roots through the stems, and all the way through the leaves, all the way through the plant. Kind of like our veins run all the way through our body. So there are two types of vascular tissue. There's what we call the xylem, which is going to conduct water and any dissolved mineral that is in that water. And this is pretty much a one-way thing, going from the roots up. So going from the roots and up to all of the areas. And actually the water eventually, the water that doesn't get used, evaporates out the stomata. Okay, so from roots to stomata. The vascular tissue called phloem is for transporting photosynthates. So it's for transporting, we'll just say sugars, from sources to sinks. What does that mean? Well, a source is anywhere that we're making those sugars. So a leaf would be a really common source tissue. So this would be a really common source tissue, making. So the cells in the leaf will make these sugars and put them into the phloem. And they will be headed to sinks. A sink is anywhere that needs the sugar, either for its active metabolism, so maybe it's a developing flower that needs some sugar in order to, have enough nutrients to grow, or maybe it's it could be a newly developing leaf that can't photosynthesize yet. Oftentimes it's to a root and for storage. So a lot of these sugars get sent to the roots where they can be stored maybe over winter, so they're available to the plant the next growing season. So let's look at this xylem a little more closely. So the interesting thing about xylem is that these cells are actually dead at maturity. When they are fully functional, ready to use, they are not alive anymore. Little sad, but true. And let's take a look. There are actually two types of xylem cells. Gymnosperms only have a type of xylem cell called tracheids. So these tracheids are these sort of tapered looking cells. I guess I'm writing red on red, so that's not very good to see. Kind of these tapered looking cells that sort of lay end to end, and water can pass within them, and water is also able to pass. They have these pits in them right here, and the pits in the walls of these tracheids can allow the water to also move freely from tracheid to tracheid. Oops, I'm having an issue here. Sorry about that. So I should also mention that these are extremely thick-walled cells, except for these pits. So these pits allow the water to move freely. So if you're a gymnosperm, you've got tracheids. Now, flowering plants have a different type of xylem cell that are known as vessel elements. So these vessel elements, rather than kind of being tapered and sort of staggered, have this kind of staggered layering, they are more straightforwardly stacked end to end. They also have pits, but they also have these really large end-to-end pits where we can get a lot of water flow from one cell to the next in these vessel elements. So we see these in flowering plants. There are some angiosperms that also contain tracheids in addition to their vessel elements, but the vessel elements are unique to the angiosperms. We don't see the gymnosperms with the vessel elements. All right, let's talk phloem. Phloem is actually living at maturity. So that's nice for the phloem. So phloem are made of specialized cells called sieve tube elements. So each of these is known as a sieve tube element. And we can see in between the sieve tube elements is this plate that is highly perforated to allow the fluid containing the photosynthetates, such as the sugars, to move between them. So here's an example of one of those sieve plates right there. Now, kind of a cool thing about the phloem cells is that they contain, or they have with them, companion cells. So in the phloem cell, in the sieve tube elements, there's not a lot of cytoplasm here, right? The cell has been modified to basically be a hollow tube, so it's lost a lot of its important organelles that would normally allow it to keep living. So the way that it can stay a living cell is that it pairs up with this companion cell, and this companion cell is sort of the life support system. For the sieve tube element. It has all of its organelles, and it can produce all of the proteins and other cellular structures that this sieve tube element needs to remain alive. So it doesn't have to worry about it. It can just do the job of basically being a hollow tube. Okay, so let's talk about ground tissue. So ground tissue really is anything that's not vascular tissue or dermal tissue. It's a kind of a catch-all for everything else. Sometimes we will refer to ground tissue as either being pith or cortex. If it's pith, it's ground tissue that is inside the vascular tissue that lies to the interior of it. If it's cortex, it's ground tissue that is outside the vascular tissue. So, for example, in this particular example, the ground tissue here would be considered cortex because the xylem and phloem are in the interior here and the ground tissue is outside of it. Now, it really just depends on the arrangement of the particular plant organ, whether we call this pith or cortex, or whether it even is easy to distinguish. So this ground tissue includes cells that fill space and provide structure, that store material, that do photosynthesis, that maybe transport substances over short distances, not the same as xylem and phloem would. But we see three major types of cells in all of our tissue types, actually, that I want to talk about. We're going to look at these a little bit in lab. There are what we call parenchyma cells, collenchyma cells, and sclerenchyma cells. And I know it sounds like I made those names up. I swear I didn't. That's what they're really called. So parenchyma cells are these thin-walled cells that typically have large central vacuoles. I can't spell today. These are very frequently the site of photosynthesis and also play a big role in storage. They can typically readily divide to give rise to new cells. So oftentimes at these parenchyma cells that will kind of go into action and divide to maybe heal a wound in the plant tissue. Now, the collenchyma cells collenchyma cells have primary cell walls that are a little bit thicker. And they are typically for providing support. So we oftentimes find these in things like the stalks of leaves, or maybe in non-woody stems, or some growing organs, because although it is strong and supportive, it's also a flexible support. A lot of times what you see is that these cells are a little more thickened, like in the corners, and so they still have some flexibility. A good example of collenchyma cells are these strings in a piece of celery, right, that you get stuck in your teeth. The reason you can't really chew those is because they're collenchyma cells that have had a little bit extra thick cell wall. And then finally, the thickest of all are the sclerenchyma cells. So these have highly thickened secondary walls. Many are actually dead at maturity. And there are two types. There's what we call fibers, which are elongated cells. that provide rigid support. So I don't have a good picture, but a fiber would be something like this, a really thick-walled, elongated cell. And then we also have a type called scalarids that are densely packed, irregularly shaped cells. Which is what we're looking at in this image. So we find these scalarids, a good example where you'll find scalarids are in like the shells of nuts. That's what makes them so hard. Or if you've ever eaten a pear, you know how it's got that sandy kind of texture to it? Those are little scalarids all through the fruit tissue that help give it a little more strength and support. So those are three types of cells that we'll see making up a lot of different plant tissues, playing a big role. So we are going to end here, and we're going to pick up talking about some more plant organs and tissues, and delving into how these different organs and tissues look a little bit different in our different plant groups. So see you soon.